Hi everyone, I hope you're doing okay today on Wednesday. What I'm going to do here is give you another brief lecture on Charles Mill's Racial Contract. In particular, I want to focus on today's reading. He describes several different contracts within the larger racial contract that I talked about in Monday's reading. Um, he talks about how there are several contracts sort of contained within this larger thing that he's calling the racial contract. In particular, I want to focus on what he calls an epistemological contract, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. But that is something I really want to focus on. It's one of the um, questions that you can choose to respond to in the discussion post if you'd like. But I want to say a bit more about some other things before talking about that epistemological contract. So Mills in today's reading is saying that there are, again, several contracts within the racial contract. There is the political contract, there's the moral contract, and there is the epistemological contract. Then, within the political contract, there is a distinction between the formation of society and the formation of the state. And we've already discussed that distinction previously in both Hobbes and Locke. Within the political contract, the agreement to form society is simply an agreement to leave the state of nature, to leave behind the conditions of the state of nature, wherein, for example, with Hobbes, there was the right of everything to everyone, and for Locke, the right to punish transgressions and be a judge, jury in my own case. So we have to sort of agree initially to give that up and to leave that behind and to leave the state of nature. And that is the agreement to leave the state of nature, to form some kind of society. Then there is the agreement to form a government or a state. And that is where we transfer away our rights to some other body or entity or group of people that will then govern over us. And so, again, agreement to form society, agreement to form government. Within the political contract, two contracts. Now, what is the moral contract? The moral contract, Mills describes as how morality is going to be decided when we leave the state of nature, or how is it that how is morality figured out? Um, excuse me. And for Mills, or excuse me, yes, for Mills, within the moral contract, he makes a distinction between two different ways of thinking about how morality works when we leave the state of nature. So for Hobbes, morality was totally absent in the state of nature. In fact, morality is entirely created by the state. So there is no morality in the state of nature. There's no morality at all, and it's entirely created once we form society and once we form government within the political contract. So there is really no moral contract for Hobbes. Within Locke, the moral contract was there. We actually could figure out morality in the state of nature using our own reason, referring to the law of nature. Recall that Locke basically has a version of the golden rule, which is one ought not to harm another in his life, liberty, or possession. So it's a version of the golden rule. Locke thinks we can access that using our reason. So there is morality in the state of nature. Morality in the state and morality in society is based upon a pre-existing moral code. So the laws are based upon a pre-existing moral code. So that covers the political contract and the moral contract. So within the political contract, there's the agreement to form society, agreement to form the state. Within the moral contract, there are then two versions of that. And so within social contract theory that Mills is talking about, there is the Hobbesian version where there is no morality, and that morality sort of comes into being with the creation of state and society. And for Locke, there is the fact that state and society base their laws upon a pre-existing moral code. Now, what Mills wants to do is to think about, in light of what he's saying about the moral contract as a non-ideal historical descriptive account of what the social contract actually was, he wants to say, well, in light of what I've said about what the racial contract is, then what how were these contracts actually set up? Because again, Mills is describing a real historical event here. And so he wants to say, in light of the fact that I am the only one who is describing what actually happened with the contract that was formed, we now have to rethink the meaning of the political contract, and we have to rethink the meaning of the moral contract in light of what I've offered, or what Mills has offered, as the racial contract. So the key thing to sort of think about here is, again, for Mills, the way that all this logic changes according to the racial contract is that now, so leaving the state of nature, this harkens back to Sartwell. We don't. There's only some of us ever actually leave the state of nature. So in terms of white European colonization of certain areas of the world, the only individuals capable of leaving the state of nature were white Europeans, and everyone else remained in the state of nature. So not everyone was capable of joining and forming the contract. So what Mills is saying here is that when European colonists encountered those who they wanted to colonize, they weren't confident that they could be brought into the political and into the political contract, and so these people needed the assistance of white European men to be brought into the political contract. So without the intervention of white men, without the intervention of white European men, these people would permanently remain in the state of nature, and so they required assistance to be brought into the contract. In the form of basically, again, of colonizing their lands and their territories. And so that is sort of, again, that's the sense in which this is a real historical event. So in terms of the political contract, the agreement to form society between whites and non-whites is simply the idea that they needed to be brought in, that there was no formal agreement between whites and non-whites. It was, you either be brought into the contract or we take over your land. And so there wasn't really a choice being given here. And so that's what's going on with the political contract. And so, again, the sense in which, for Mills, the political contract, the agreement to form society and the agreement to form the state, is not a horizontal agreement between everybody. So it's not between whites and non-whites. It's an agreement of whites over non-white. So it's a vertical contract, not a horizontal one. And so that's what's going on with the agreement to form society. The agreement to form the state is simply, according to Mills, it's the creation of a state that will simply continue to maintain the system of privilege and oppression that has been already created in the agreement to form society. So the state is simply created to maintain a system of privilege and oppression. And so that is what is going on with the creation of the state. It's not some neutral body who creates laws that apply to everybody. The goal is to create a set of laws that apply to some groups of people and not to other groups of people. And so, again, I don't think there's lots of precedents. It's not hard to see this throughout Western history, what Mills is describing, and he thinks this is what the racial contract actually was. And so there's the agreement to form society, which is to leave certain people out and only give them the choice to come in if they give up their land. And then there's the creation of the state that simply maintains what has already been created in the society. And so that's what Mills is up to here with the moral and the political contract. And so I'm trying to look through so I have the notes here open for today, and I just want to look through and see if there's anything I'm leaving out. So we've got the so there's one important point that I want to point to that Mills recognizes is in today's reading. Mill writes, quote, on page 11, he writes, importantly, he notes, All whites are beneficiaries of the contract, though some whites are not signatories. So that distinction between beneficiary and signatory is an important one, because this is not somehow an indictment of every single living white person who ever has lived and whoever will live. He is saying not all of you would have agreed to the original racial contract. You may have not liked what was happening when the terms of this contract were originally set up, but yet we are living with the legacy of the racial contract. So you are in some ways benefiting from a system of privileges that was set up during white European colonialism, but you were not a signatory to it. And so you benefit from it, but you may not have liked or agreed to what the original terms of the contract were. So this is often, I think, an easy way to think about this is with a concept like white privilege, is that white privilege is a term that's thrown about a lot by a lot of people, and it's difficult for some to hear because they say, well, what privilege are you talking about? I don't have any privilege. I didn't ask for this privilege. And that's precisely the point. You didn't ask for the privilege. But by virtue of a world that was set up prior to you maybe hundreds of years ago, you are benefiting in some ways from a system that pre-existed you. And so you are a beneficiary, but not a signatory. And so that's a sense in which the question is, what do you do when you recognize, when Mills provides you with this kind of critique and says you are benefiting from a system of privilege that you didn't ask for, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to continue to benefit from it? Are you going to become aware of it and try to do something to change it? So what are you going to do once you're made aware of your privilege? It's not that you should just give it up entirely, but maybe you could work to change the world or make it better. And so that distinction between signatory and beneficiary, I think, is crucial for what Mills is doing, because it doesn't mean that every single living white person who benefits from a system that pre-existed them is somehow a terrible, evil human being. Mills is not doing that. Most people who are engaged in racial critique are not interested in condemning every white person. They are saying, though, that whether you like it or not, whether you chose it or not, the system pre-existed you and continues to exist, and you benefit from it, whether you realize it or not. And Mills wants to say, I'm making you aware of this. Now, what are you going to do about it? So that I wanted to make sure I hit that distinction. Now, let's talk about this epistemological contract. That is this kind of innovation that Mills is bringing to the table here. It's not something that we've talked about in reference to any kind of social contract theory to this point. And so what is Mills up to when he's talking about there being so in addition to a moral contract, in addition to a political contract, he says there is an epistemological contract. Now, what does he mean? Well, first of all, what's epistemology? So epistemology is, again, a branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge. It asks questions like, how do we know the world? What does it mean to know the world? When do we know that we have something like knowledge? Or when do we only know that we have something like belief? What's the difference between opinion, belief, and knowledge? So epistemology is kind of its own branch of philosophy. It's got lots and lots of questions that people that do epistemology deal with. And the question is, what does this have to do with the social contract? And what Mills wants to say is that there is a kind of knowledge involved when we move from something like the state of nature to the state and the society. And the question is, how do we know what morality is? So the epistemology of the state of nature and political society for social contract theory is something like natural law. Natural law is how we have access to something like morality. It is especially for Locke, is that we can access what morality is in the state of nature through using our reason and accessing what Locke and other theorists have called natural laws. That we don't need the state or society to tell us what morality is. We are capable of figuring that out on our own. And so that is, in a sense, there is a kind of epistemology within social contract theory. Now, that's not exactly what Mills is talking about. When Mills is talking about this epistemological contract, what is he saying? So I'm going to go here to page, I'm on page 5 of the notes that are uploaded for today. So I'm going to read, so real quick. So for social contract theorists, the epistemology associated with it was natural law. This law of nature is objectively knowable through the use of our reason. It is objective morality, and through the use of human reason, we can access it. To be able to know this morality, one is granted access to what Mills calls, quote, an epistemic community. In this sense, he thinks it can be considered a contract. Now, this is where Mills is going to say that, well, what Mills wants to say about the epistemological contract is, look, whites and Europeans have set up a system in which they have colonized native peoples and taken over their lands, taken over their territories. And what's happening with the creation of state and society is that they don't want to see the system that they have created. They're not going to come out and say that we are creating the state and creating the society simply to maintain our system of privilege that already exists prior to the creation of the state and society. So what Mills says is that when the racial contract is created, there is an agreement to not see the world as it is, but in fact, there is an agreement to construct a reality that doesn't see the world as it is. And so it's an agreement to misinterpret the world. It's what Mills calls an epistemology of ignorance. So the goal is not to know the world as it actually is, which is to say, one that has been structured in a way that oppresses and privileges one group of people over another. It is an agreement to not see that and to say that we live in a world in which anyone can get ahead, everything's okay. And so they're not going to openly say we are creating the state to maintain our system of privilege and oppression. The goal is we create the state as some neutral body that is simply going to enforce laws that apply to everybody. But the truth is, that isn't the truth. But they're not going. So the goal is not to acknowledge that the state was designed to maintain privilege and oppression. The goal is to say that the state was created to enforce laws that apply to everybody. So why does Mills think that this is a contract? Well, it seems to be the case that why would those who have engaged in these kind of horrible practices of colonization and oppression want to openly admit with the creation of the state that that's what they have done? So the point is, what Mills says, and this I'm reading from the notes here, he says, the racial contract requires that those who benefit from it are supposed to maintain a certain blindness related to issues of race in order to maintain the white polity that the contract establishes. So it is an epistemology of ignorance which allows for something like a racial contract to exist and to go unnoticed. So that is what Mills is up to here, that it is. So let me just say a bit more about this because it may seem a little bit strange, and I don't know, maybe hopefully you're following along with what I'm saying, but I think the easiest way to think about this is in reference to contemporary notions of something like color blindness. For people who say, I don't see race, I don't see the world in terms of different races, everybody's human, we're all the same. Again, color blindness is a particular kind of ideology that a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned white individuals want to suggest is how we should look at the world. And Mills wants to say that something like color blindness is itself a symptom of this epistemology of ignorance, which is to say we must try and see the world as non-racialized. Because if we were to see the world as racialized, fundamentally racialized, we would have to acknowledge that we are complicit in the problem of the way that the world has been set up. Again, this gets back to that distinction between being a beneficiary and a signatory to the contract. We may not have been signatories to the racial contract, but we certainly benefit from the racial contract. And so what we try to do as white people is see the world as non-racialized. We construct a world in which race is not a real thing, and that we don't have to see it. And that allows us to maintain a blindness and an ignorance to the realities of things like racism. It allows us to say, I don't see race, everybody's human, and things like that. And so that is a privilege itself to be able to do that. And so Mills wants to expose this and say, you have to agree to see the world that way. You have to, there was an agreement to see the world that way. It is itself a contract to subscribe to that kind of ignorance that doesn't see the world as racialized. Even if we are uncomfortable seeing the world as racialized, even if we're uncomfortable seeing the world in terms of racism, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't. And so Mills is kind of saying, to sort of reiterate a point I've made several times now, that we must ignore the world as it actually is and see it as we want it, or see it as we want it to be. Because to see it as it actually is would be to acknowledge our privilege, and then we might actually have to do something to change it. But as long as we don't see the world as it actually is, then we can continue to benefit from a system that oppresses one group of people and privileges us. So that is the point of the epistemological contract. He thinks it lives with us today. Again, something like color blindness and saying things like everybody's human, I don't see race. That itself is a form of ignorance, that you are willfully, or maybe not willfully, but you are not seeing the world. You are not seeing the legacy of European colonialism over the past several centuries. That even though may not be as explicit as it was then, there are still lots of effects and legacies today that live with us of the system that was set up hundreds of years ago in the form of European colonialism. So that's all I want to say about the epistemological contract. I hope that makes sense. I hope you can see what Mills is saying and how. And the biggest picture here is thinking about how everything that we've learned about the social contract to this point changes in light of what Mills is saying. That all of the components of the social contract have to take on new meaning in light of the fact that Mills is saying this is and was the contract. The racial contract is the reality of the social contract. And so we must acknowledge how the meaning of everything like it associated with the social contract changes in light of the real racial contract. Okay? So that's all I want to say today. I hope this was helpful. And I don't know that I'll have another video posted for this week, but next week when we move in, I think you move into Martin Luther King Jr. for next week. I'll have some things to say about that in reference to next week's readings, and I will talk to you soon. Okay?